Welcome to the last video in the World War I unit. These are the topics that we're going to be covering. We're covering the end of the war and then the peace process that ensued after. So let's just jump right into it. So when America declares war on Germany and they decided they're going to join World War I, European leaders didn't really know what to expect. They questioned whether the U.S. could really raise, train, equip, and transport an army fast enough to really make a difference in the outcome of the war. But the U.S. did get it together enough to actually make a huge impact on the war. And one of the big impacts that they had has to do with convoys to protect shipping. Now we know that Germany had an unrestricted submarine warfare. So to combat this, the Allies adopted an old naval tactic, which is convoying. So in a convoy, groups of merchant ships would sail together and they would be protected by warships. And the arrangement was designed to provide safety at sea. So if they were going to attack, they would be attacking the warships on the outside versus the things or the passenger ships or the supply ships that would be in toward the middle. So the shipping losses from U-boat attacks fell sharply, and Germany's gamble had failed. Another important thing to know about the U.S. joining World War I is General John J. Pershing. So he was the commander of the armed forces in Europe. He arrives in France in June of 1917 with a small armed force, a small American force. And it wasn't really until the beginning of 1918 that American troops began to arrive in large numbers. And the American troops were actually called doughboys. And the doughboys would see some significant action in the late spring and summer of 1918. Now, just really quick, why do you think that the convoy was an effective method against the German U-boat? Just make sure that you have an answer for that so we could discuss it tomorrow in class. And let's keep on going. Now, although it took some time, American troops learned to fight quickly and they learned to fight bravely. I mean, they hadn't fought in trench warfare since the Civil War. And I could go on and I could give you a list of battles of who won, who lost, how many people died, blah, 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 blah. But I don't think that's necessarily very relevant to what I want you guys to know about World War I. Just know that when America joined the war, that the American troops added to those of France and Britain gave allies a military advantage. And by the fall of 1918, the German front was collapsing. And they were collapsing so much that some of them had decided to just desert the army, or they had refused to fight altogether. And so the leaders really faced little choice but to surrender. And surrender they did on November 11th at 1918 at 11 a.m. was officially the end of the war. Germany surrenders to the Allies. World War I was over. And of the millions of soldiers who were mobilized to fight, almost 5 million, almost 5 million Allied and 8 million Central Power troops were dead. And nearly 6.5 million civilians were also killed. You know, they were victims of this terrible conflict. So it was left to the peacekeepers, to the peacemakers, to determine whether or not the results could really justify the costs. So what was going to be the plan for peace? Now, remember Vladimir Lenin? He was the leader of the communist revolution in Russia. He maintained that this entire war was nothing more than an imperialistic land grab, that this war was fought for imperialistic gain. And President Wilson did not necessarily see the war about it being, about acquisitions of land or about imperialism. It was a war that was for peace and for freedom. So in January of 1917, Wilson had already started to introduce the idea of a peace without victory. No one's going to win. We're just going to gain peace. This war is going to be over, but no one's really going to be a winner or a loser. The war is just going to end. And Wilson answered Lenin's charge about the nature of the conflict by outlining America's war aims in what became known as the 14 points. So Wilson proposed a peace inspired by noble ideals and not greed and vengeance. And the 14 points sought to fundamentally change the world by promoting openness, encouraging independence, supporting freedom, and he also called for open diplomacy. He insisted on freedom of the seas, free trade, a movement toward ending colonization, and a general reduction in weapons across the board. He also championed for national self-determination, or the idea of people having the right to choose their own form of government. And this would lead to the creation of several new independent states, but it also raised many questions about about which populations would really achieve statehood and under what circumstance. And then finally, he asked for the creation or the formation of a League of Nations to, and this is a direct quote from him, to secure mutual guarantee of political independence and territorial integrity to great and small stakes alike. Basically, the League of Nations is an early version of the United Nations that we know today. Now, Wilson's idealism did not necessarily inspire the other Allied leaders at the peace conference. They blamed Germany for starting the war, and they reminded that they had suffered more than Wilson had because the U.S. entered in really late. And they insisted that Germany make reparations or payments for the war damages. They wanted to weaken Germany so that Germany could never actually threaten Europe again. The British and the French prime ministers knew that their citizens didn't just expect peace, but they expected victory. And that is something that Woodrow Wilson was against. He wanted, like we said before, a peace without victory, while England and France did not support that idea. So once the Versailles Conference began, Wilson started to lose a number of battles. Everything that he basically wanted, the Allies didn't, and they fought against him for that. But the one thing that Woodrow Wilson really wanted was a League of Nations, which would be a world organization where countries could gather together and peacefully resolve their issues. And on this one point of the League of Nations, Woodrow Wilson refused to compromise, and finally the other delegates voted to make the League of Nations a part of their treaty. And the treaty is, of course, the Versailles Treaty. So this is the outcome of the war, of the peace treaty at the end of the war. So Germany was forced to take full blame for the war. They had to completely disarm. They had to make huge payments to the Allies, and they had to give up all of its colonies to the Allies as well. So at the end, Germany was angry with the outcome of the war. They were humiliated by having to take full responsibility for the war. And this really does set the stage for World War II, which we'll talk about in a second. So in the end, the various peace treaties created almost as many problems as they solved. In the new map that came after World War I, they emerged from the Versailles Conference, national self-determination was violated almost as often as it was actually confirmed. In Europe, several populations of Germans found themselves attached now to non-German nations, and this was true for several Austrian populations. So you may have once belonged to Germany, but now you had the development of other nations, and maybe now you belong to Poland, or maybe now you belong to a newly found country of Czechoslovakia. And so you no longer had that identity that you once did in your old country that you once belonged to. When Woodrow Wilson left Versailles to return to the U.S., he knew that the Versailles Treaty was not necessarily perfect, but he believed that over time that the League of Nations could correct its problems, and he still thought that a lasting peace would emerge from the Versailles Treaty. The German Americans thought that the treaty was too harsh toward Germany, because why did they have to take all the blame when they weren't the only ones involved in the war? And the Irish Americans criticized the treaty for failing to create an independent Ireland. So you had criticism from all different sides, all different angles on the Versailles Treaty. Wilson had compromised in Versailles, but he was not very ready to compromise in Washington, D.C. When the Senate delayed the ratification vote, Wilson took its case directly to the people. So the Senate didn't want to pass the Versailles Treaty. They definitely did not want to pass the League of Nations because they wanted the U.S. to kind of mind its own business and stay out of world affairs. So Wilson decided to take his case directly to the people, and he started going across the country, like touring across the country. He gave 32 speeches in 33 days. And then finally in Colorado on September 25th in 1919, he he passed out. His health was failing. He was rushed back to DC, and then a few days later, he suffered a stroke, and he was basically rendered useless. It said that his wife basically ran the country for the remaining months of his presidency, and the Senate, prepared to vote, basically voted to reject the Treaty of Versailles and oppose the League of Nations, which is something that President Wilson wanted so much. Now, here are the allies that agreed to form the League of Nations, and you can see that anybody that's in kind of that hot pink or non-members, they voted to not participate in that. And the U.S. is in hot pink. I mean, the U.S. is the country that came up with this idea, but the Senate refused to support it, and that was really President Wilson's baby, and unfortunately, he didn't get to see its passage. Now, we talked about World War I kind of being a catalyst for World War II. So I want you to think of World War I in that top picture where you had that creepy guy with the lawnmower as like a weed. And you may go ahead and mow down that weed or cut it, but its roots still exist. And the roots would be the mania, or the main from mania, the militarism, the alliances, the imperialism, and the nationalism. You could get rid of the weed, but the roots that caused that weed to grow are still there. And that's kind of what the Treaty of Versailles did. It got rid of the weed, but it didn't necessarily get rid of the roots. And World War I, or the Treaty of Versailles, contributes greatly to the commencement or to the rise of Hitler and the start of World War II. So with that being said, here are 7 questions that you guys should be able to answer if you took all the correct notes. And I will see you guys tomorrow in class.